The first thing they heard was the hiss, low, industrial, like steam escaping a ruptured boiler, but carrying underneath it a promise of something older and more terrible. February 19, 1945. The black sand of Iwo Jima radiated cold in the pre-dawn, volcanic grit fine enough to jam rifle actions and clog canteen caps. Offshore, the Pacific rolled gray and indifferent. Inland, Mount Suribachi squatted like a broken molar against the sky, honeycombed with tunnels that breathed cool air even as the surface baked. The Marines had been told the island was small, 8 square miles, barely a decent ranch back in Kansas, and that naval bombardment had softened it. What they had not been told, because no one yet understood, was that Iwo Jima had been engineered into a single, vast killing machine, and that the standard tools of assault, rifle, grenade, bayonet, courage, would prove grotesquely insufficient. Somewhere in the maze of bunkers and spider holes, Japanese defenders crouched in silence, waiting for the Americans to step into geometry. They expected the usual: men, mortars, maybe a tank or two bogged in ash. They did not expect what came next. The Navy had pounded Iwo for 74 consecutive days before the landing. Battleship shells, each the weight of a sedan, had cratered the island's surface until it resembled the moon. Pilots returning from strikes reported entire hillsides erased, pillboxes obliterated, gun emplacements reduced to scrap. Intelligence officers drew confident circles on their maps. But volcanic rock is a poor conductor of shock, and the Japanese had dug deep, 15, 20, sometimes 30 feet down, connecting their positions with miles of tunnel. When the bombardment lifted and the first waves of Amtraks churned toward the beaches, the defenders simply climbed back to their firing ports, brushed off the dust, and waited. The Marines hit the beach at 900 hours. Within minutes, the slopes above erupted. Machine gun fire poured from apertures invisible until they sparked. Mortars dropped with metronomic precision. The black sand swallowed men to their knees, turning every step into labor. By nightfall, 2,000 Americans were casualties, and the beachhead was a shallow, bloody crescent barely 300 yards deep. Division commanders radioed for support. What arrived 2 days later would rewrite the calculus of fortified defense. She went by the call sign Ember 6, and her name was Lieutenant Margaret Renner, though most of the men in the mechanized flame platoon knew her only as the prop officer who signed off on the nozzle mods. She had joined the program 18 months earlier, after a tour inspecting Sherman production lines in Detroit, where she'd caught an engineer bleeding hydraulic pressure into a turret traverse motor, and written him up with such clinical precision that the plant superintendent reassigned her to special projects. Code for weapons, the brass wanted kept quiet until they worked. The flamethrower tank had been a theory in 1943, a prototype in early 44, and by January 45, a 30-ton fact rumbling through coral dust in the Marianas. It married a standard M4 Sherman chassis to a redesigned turret housing a flame gun capable of hurling napalm 150 yards. The fuel, a jellied mix of gasoline and a thickening agent developed by chemists at Harvard, clung to whatever it touched and burned at 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, consume oxygen, and turn a pillbox into an oven. The Marines had requested 8 of them for Iwo. Margaret's job was to make sure all 8 worked when the ramp dropped. Dockside Saipan, 400 hours. The tanks idle in a row, exhausts ticking as they cool. I check each nozzle throat with a penlight looking for carbon fouling. One of the crew chiefs asks if I'm nervous. I tell him I'm more worried about a clogged injector than a Nambu round. He laughs, but I'm not joking. Fire doesn't care about courage. The Mark I flamethrower system, officially designated POA-CWS-H1, weighed nearly 4 tons when fully fueled. Its main reservoir held 290 gallons of napalm, pressurized by a pair of nitrogen bottles mounted in the sponsons. The gun itself was a steel wand as thick as a man's forearm, mounted coaxially where the bow machine gun used to sit, operated by the assistant driver via hand grip and trigger. Effective range was advertised at 150 yards. Practical range, accounting for wind and angle, was closer to 100. The system could fire for roughly 60 seconds before running dry, which meant every burst had to count. Margit had personally test-fired each unit at a makeshift range outside Guam, logging pressure curves, burn times, and nozzle erosion rates in a ledger she kept locked in her footlocker. She knew, for instance, that tank number 4 ran hot and needed its nitrogen regulators dialed back too high, and that tank 7 had a hairline crack in its fuel feed that would catastrophically fail after exactly 43 seconds of continuous discharge. She'd swapped the feed line herself, working under a tarp in 100-degree heat while mechanics watched in silence. No one questioned her after that. The Japanese had never seen a flamethrower tank. They had encountered man-portable flamethrowers, backpack units carried by infantry vulnerable short-ranged, and had developed tactics to deal with them. Concentrate fire on the operator, aim for the fuel tanks, close distance before ignition. But a Sherman wrapped in armor and spitting liquid fire was a different equation. The first encounter happened on D+2, February 21st, near the base of Suribachi. A reinforced bunker complex, invisible from the air and impervious to artillery, had pinned down 2 companies of Marines for 6 hours. The bunker's firing slit was a horizontal crack barely 8 inches tall, cut into concrete 3 feet thick, positioned to enfilade the approach. Grenades bounced off. Satchel charges detonated too far away. The Marines were bleeding out in the open when the call came down, "Bring up Ember 3." The tank nosed forward, tracks chewing through ash, turret traversing with hydraulic slowness. At 70 yards, the bow erupted. The napalm stream arced like a sunrise, a liquid curve of orange and black that poured through the firing slit and into the bunker's interior. The screaming lasted 4 seconds. The smoke, oily and dense, continued for an hour. I wasn't there. I was back at the LSD anchorage, checking fuel batch numbers against a manifest that didn't match. But I heard it over the radio net. Call St. Frost 2-1 requesting immediate medevac for burns, not American burns, Japanese burns, enemy wounded stumbling out of a hillside with their uniforms melted to their skin. The corpsman's voice was shaking. I made a note in the margin. Napalm adheres post-combustion. Verify humane protocols. Then I crossed it out. There are no humane protocols for a weapon like this. The tank crews gave their machines nicknames. Ember 3 was bad news. Ember 5 was Zippo, after the cigarette lighter. Ember 7, the one with the replaced fuel line, was Lucky. The crews were volunteers mostly, pulled from regular Sherman outfits and given 2 weeks of specialized training. How to purge the system, how to clear a jam, how to avoid cooking off your own ammunition if a round punctured the fuel tank. The assistant driver, the man who actually fired the flame gun, sat in the hull's right front, cramped into a space barely large enough to turn around in, breathing recycled air that smelled of gasoline and sweat. His field of view was a narrow slit. His trigger was a thumb lever. If the tank took a hit and the fuel ignited, he had perhaps 3 seconds to bail out, assuming the hatch wasn't jammed, assuming he wasn't already unconscious from smoke inhalation, assuming the fire didn't flash back through the turret and consume him before he moved. Casualty rates among flame tank crews were projected at 60% over a 30-day campaign. Iwo Jima took 36 days. By the end of the first week, the Japanese command had issued new orders to forward units, prioritized destruction of flame tanks. Anti-tank teams were redeployed, shifting from conventional Shermans to the flame variants. Satchel charges, magnetic mines, and kamikaze squads were directed to target the fuel sponsons. It worked, sometimes. Ember 1 took a 47 round through the right sponson on day 6 and burned for 3 hours, a pyre visible from the ship's offshore. Ember 4 threw a track in a shell crater, immobilized, and was swarmed by a suicide squad that managed to wedge a Bangalore torpedo under the hull before the covering infantry cut them down. The tank survived. The crew did not. But for every flame tank lost, a dozen bunkers were cracked, 100 yards of trench line sterilized. a hillside cleansed of fighting positions that would have cost 50 Marines apiece to reduce by conventional means. The calculus was brutal and irrefutable. Fire worked. The sensory signature of the flame attack became a psychological weapon in itself. Japanese soldiers, dug into positions they believed impregnable, learned to recognize the sound of a Sherman's engine note, distinct from the higher whine of a Stuart, deeper than a half-track. When that sound approached, accompanied by the hiss of pressurizing nitrogen and the clank of traverse gears, men began to abandon positions before the flame even ignited. Post-battle interrogations conducted through interpreters in the POW stockades revealed a consistent theme. The fire was inescapable. A rifle bullet could miss. Artillery could land long. But napalm, once released, filled every corner, consumed every breath, and left no shadow to hide in. One prisoner, a junior sergeant who had survived the destruction of his company's command bunker, described it as liquid sun poured from the sky. Another, a naval infantryman from the 109th Division, said only that the tanks were Oni, demons, and refused to elaborate. Margit received the first batch of after-action reports on Day 8 and spent the night cross-referencing firing logs against fuel consumption data. Tank number 3 had expended its load in 58 seconds, 2 seconds faster than specification, which suggested either a pressure leak or an overeager trigger finger. Tank 5 had reported a partial jam after 30 seconds, but had cleared it and continued firing. She made a note to inspect the valve seat for carbon buildup. Tank 7, her personal problem child, had performed flawlessly through 4 separate engagements, burning through 287 gallons without incident. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction, then turned to the casualty list. 2 crew killed outright, 3 wounded, 1 evacuated for psychiatric evaluation after his tank took a direct hit that killed the driver but left him, the flame gunner, unscathed. She wrote a memo recommending rotational rest periods and was ignored. "We're burning them out like wasps from a nest, and it works, God help us, it works. But I can't stop thinking about the captured film reels the intelligence section showed us, Japanese training films, their soldiers practicing how to die for the emperor. They're not cowards, they're terrified. There's a difference. I wonder if our crews can tell." The island's geography compounded every problem. Iwo Jima was a logistics nightmare. No natural harbor, no piers, no docks. Every ton of fuel, ammunition, water, and rations had to be ferried ashore by landing craft, unloaded by hand or crane onto a beach under intermittent artillery fire, then trucked forward over roads that didn't exist until engineers bulldozed them into being. The flame tanks required constant resupply. Each full load of napalm weighed over 2,000 pounds and was good for perhaps 4 engagements before the tanks rolled back to the beach for refueling. The fuel itself arrived in 55-gallon drums, stacked in cargo nets, hoisted by cranes that frequently broke down. Mixing stations were established in sandbagged pits behind the lines, where chemical troops in rubberized suits blended gasoline with thickening powder, poured the result into portable tanks, then pumped it into the Shermans via hand-cranked transfer pumps. The work was dangerous. Napalm spills ignited from static sparks, engine heat, careless cigarettes, and thankless. Margit spent half her time at the mixing pits, clipboard in hand, ensuring batch consistency, checking viscosity, and arguing with supply officers who wanted to dilute the mix to stretch their stocks. The second week saw the fighting shift toward the island's northern plateau, a broken expanse of ridges and ravines where the Japanese had concentrated their remaining strength. Here, the terrain favored the defender absolutely. Ravines funneled attackers into enfilades. Ridgelines provided overlapping fields of fire. Caves opened onto reverse slopes, invisible until Marines crested the ridge and found themselves silhouetted against the sky. Conventional tactics stalled. Flame tanks were called forward. The crews developed a grim routine. Advance to the ridge, suppress enemy fire with the turret's 75mm gun, close to within 100 yards, then hose the cave mouth with napalm until nothing moved. The caves were deep. some extending hundreds of feet into the plateau's core, and a single burst often wasn't enough. The tanks would pause, wait for the smoke to thin, then fire again methodically until the flames stopped drawing return fire. Sometimes survivors stumbled out, arms raised, clothing smoldering. Sometimes they didn't. Radio chatter during these engagements had a clipped procedural quality that concealed the horror underneath. Ember 6, Frost 2 Actual Target Cave Complex Grid 589er Authenticate Tango. Frost 2 Actual Ember 6 Authenticated Moving Up. Ember 6 Hold for RD 30 seconds. A pause, crump of distant howitzers. Ember 6 Clear to engage. Roger, engaging now. The hiss of ignition. A pause. Frost 2 Actual Target Suppressed Request Assessment. Ember 6 Stand by. Another pause. Ember 6 Frost 2 Actual Negative Movement Good Effect Return to line. Roger, RTB. And the tank would reverse, tracks grinding, while infantry moved forward to confirm the kill. Margaret listened to these exchanges on the command net, her headset crackling with static and distance, and tried to reconcile the calm professionalism of the voices with the knowledge of what good effect actually meant. By the middle of the third week, enemy resistance had fractured into isolated pockets, companies, platoons, squads, finally just individuals or pairs, dug into spider holes, emerging at night to raid supply dumps or cut communication wire. The flame tanks were pulled back to refit, their hulls scorched and pocked, track links worn to nubs, fuel systems fouled with carbon and grit. Margaret oversaw the maintenance, working alongside the crews in improvised repair yards scraped into the volcanic soil. She watched a mechanic named Kowalski disassemble a fuel injector and extract a plug of solidified napalm the size of a walnut, and she realized how close they had come to a catastrophic failure, pressurized fuel behind a blockage, the whole system a bomb waiting for ignition. She instituted a new inspection protocol, checking every injector after every mission, and caught 2 more blockages before they failed. Kowalski told her she was too careful. She told him careful was why he was still breathing. Got a letter from home today. My mother asks if I'm safe. I write back and tell her I'm fine, which is true, and that I'm doing important work, which is also true and nothing else, because what else is there to say? That I am the engineer of nightmares, that I make sure the fire burns efficiently. I fold the letter and seal it and drop it in the outgoing mail pouch and go back to checking pressure gauges. The strategic value of the flamethrower tanks was quantified in a classified report prepared by Marine Intelligence and forwarded to Fleet HQ in early March. The 8 tanks, operating over a 36-day period, had directly engaged and neutralized an estimated 650 fortified positions, bunkers, pillboxes, caves, and tunnel entrances, at a cost of 3 tanks destroyed and 12 crew casualties. By comparison, conventional assault methods, infantry charges supported by artillery and satchel charges, had averaged 1 fortification reduced per 4 hours of sustained combat and 37 Marine casualties per objective. The flame tanks reduced the equation to minutes and single-digit losses. The report concluded with a recommendation to integrate flame tank platoons into every Marine division scheduled for the invasion of Japan. Margaret read a copy and felt nothing. Not pride, not satisfaction, only a vast, cold fatigue that settled into her bones and would not leave. The Japanese learned, adapted, and died anyway. Late-war defensive manuals recovered from captured command posts included detailed sections on countering flame tanks, target the fuel sponsons, engage from the flank, use terrain to force the tank into defilade, employ suicide squads if necessary. None of it mattered. The armor was too thick. The range was too long. The volume of fire was too great. A well-placed 47 round could disable a tank, but getting into position to fire meant exposing yourself to the supporting infantry and the tank's own machine guns. Suicide squads, laden with satchel charges, could close the distance only if the tank was immobilized or unsupported, and by the third week, Marine commanders had learned not to send tanks forward without infantry screens. The tactical puzzle had no solution. The Japanese fought on because surrender was unthinkable, and they died in fire because there was no other way to remove them from the island. The volcanic rock itself became a character in the story. Black, porous, sharp enough to shred canvas and puncture tires, it absorbed heat during the day and radiated it at night. The dust, ground by tank treads and shell impacts into powder finer than talc, coated everything: weapons, rations, lungs. Marines wrapped their faces in bandanas and still coughed black. The tank's engines sucked in the dust and spat it back as exhaust, and the air above the battlefield shimmered with heat and particulate. Water was rationed. Showers were a memory. Men stopped shaving, stopped caring, stopped thinking beyond the next 100 yards. The flame tanks, rolling through this landscape like mechanical gods, left scorch marks in the stone that would remain visible for decades. Black tongues licking uphill, tracing the path of assault, monuments to fire and iron and the terrible logic of industrial war. Mount Suribachi fell on day 5. The plateau took 3 more weeks. The final pocket of resistance, a warren of tunnels in the island's northeastern corner, held out until March 26, when the last organized Japanese unit launched a final banzai charge against the 5th Marine Division's bivouac and was annihilated in 40 minutes of close-range slaughter. Mop-up operations continued for another 2 weeks. Flame tanks prowled the ridgelines, crews dismounting to peer into cave mouths, shouting in Japanese for survivors to surrender, then burning the caves when no response came. Margit accompanied one such mission, standing 100 yards back with a squad of riflemen, watching as Ember 7 methodically sterilized a hillside. The flames poured into the earth like water, vanishing into darkness, and the smoke that rose was thick and greasy and smelled like burning hair. She made no notes. There was nothing left to document. The POW stockades, erected in the shadow of Suribachi, held fewer than 200 prisoners by war's end, a surrender rate of less than 3%. The survivors were emaciated, hollow-eyed, many suffering from shrapnel wounds, dysentery, or respiratory damage from prolonged exposure to smoke and gas. They were processed according to Geneva protocols, deloused, fed, issued clean clothing, interrogated, then transferred to rear area camps. Margit visited the stockade once, accompanying a supply officer who needed her signature on a fuel requisition. She walked past the wire and saw men squatting in the sun, silent, watching her with expressions she could not read. One of them, a boy who could not have been older than 18, met her eyes and held them until she looked away. She signed the form and left and did not return. They knew what we did to them. They know what we'll do next. I wonder if they think we're monsters or if they think we're just efficient. I wonder which is worse. The legacy of Iwo Jima's flame tanks rippled through the final months of the Pacific War. Flamethrower-equipped Shermans were deployed on Okinawa in April, where they faced similar fortifications and achieved similar results. By August, when the atomic bombs fell and Japan surrendered, the Marine Corps had standardized the POA-CWS-H1 into its table of organization, and planning staffs for Operation Downfall, the canceled invasion of the home islands, had allocated flame tank battalions to every landing force. The weapons that might have burned Kyushu and Honshu were instead mothballed, scrapped, or converted back to standard gun tanks. Margit mustered out in November 1945, declined a regular commission, and returned to Detroit, where she took a position designing hydraulic systems for commercial tractors. She never spoke publicly about Iwo Jima. Her war diary, discovered in her effects after her death in 1987, remains classified. The Marines who fought on Iwo erected a monument on the beach where they landed, and years later, survivors of both sides would return to walk the black sand and climb Suribachi and stand in the tunnels, now cold and empty, and remember. The scorch marks faded. The pillboxes crumbled. The volcanic dust blew into the sea. But the arithmetic of the battle remained unchanged. 27,000 Japanese defenders, killed almost to the last man. 7,000 Americans dead, 19,000 wounded, an island purchased at a price of blood and fire that no strategic calculus could entirely justify. The flame tanks had worked. They had saved American lives by the hundreds, perhaps thousands, by breaking fortifications that could not otherwise have been broken. They had also incinerated men in their positions, burned them alive in holes they could not escape, reduced human beings to ash and smoke and screaming. Both things are true. History does not resolve the contradiction, it only records it. The sky over Iwo Jima, on the morning the island was declared secure, was clear and blue and indifferent. The engineers were already at work, grading runways, stringing wire, erecting Quonset huts. The first B-29, damaged by flak over Tokyo, made an emergency landing on March 4th, less than 2 weeks into the battle, its crew stumbling out onto a runway still under construction, still flanked by corpses and wreckage, but safe, alive, saved by an island purchased with fire. More bombers would follow, 2,400 emergency landings by war's end, and the lives saved by those landings would be tallied against the lives spent to take the island, and the arithmetic would balance or it wouldn't, depending on who did the counting. Margaret Renner, signing off on the last fuel requisition before rotation stateside, thought about that calculus often in the years that followed. She never found an equation that satisfied her. Fire consumes everything: flesh, stone, doubt, certainty. It leaves only ash, and the memory of light, and the quiet question of what we become when we wield it. The flame tanks rolled onto ships and disappeared into history, some to Okinawa, some to scrapyards, some to ordnance depots where they rusted in silence until the next war or the next or the next. The men who crewed them scattered to farms and factories and families, carrying the weight of what they had done in the private spaces where such weights are carried. The woman who made sure the fire worked returned to a country that did not know her name and built tractors that turned soil instead of burning it. And on a volcanic island in the middle of the Pacific, the wind blew through empty tunnels, and the sun rose and set, and the black sand remembered nothing and everything, depending on who came to ask.